Chapter 17 of The Warden, by Anthony Trollope. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Nick Whitley, Purley, United Kingdom. Chapter 17. Sir Abraham Haphazard. Mr. Harding was shown into a comfortable inner sitting room, looking more like a gentleman's book room than a lawyer's chambers, and there waited for Sir Abraham. Nor was he kept waiting long. In 10 or 15 minutes he heard a clatter of voices speaking quickly in the passage, and then the Attorney General entered. "Very sorry to keep you waiting, Mr. Warden," said Sir Abraham, shaking hands with him, "and sorry too to name so disagreeable an hour; but your notice was short, and as you said today, I named the very earliest hour that was not disposed of." Mr. Harding assured him that he was aware that it was he that should apologise. Sir Abraham was a tall, thin man, with hair prematurely grey, but bearing no other sign of age. He had a slight stoop, in his neck rather than his back, acquired by his constant habit of leaning forward as he addressed his various audiences. He might be 50 years old, and would have looked young for his age, had not constant work hardened his features, and given him the appearance of a machine with a mind. His face was full of intellect, but devoid of natural expression. You would say he was a man to use and then have done with, a man to be sought for on great emergencies, but ill adapted for ordinary services, a man whom you would ask to defend your property, but to whom you would be sorry to confide your love. He was bright as a diamond, and as cutting, and also as unimpressionable. He knew everyone whom to know was an honour, but he was without a friend. He wanted none, however, and knew not the meaning of the word in other than its parliamentary sense. A friend! Had he not always been sufficient to himself? And now, at 50, was it likely that he should trust another? He was married indeed, and had children, but what time had he for the soft idleness of conjugal felicity? His working days or term times were occupied from his time of rising to the late hour at which he went to rest, and even his vacations were more full of labour than the busiest days of other men. He never quarrelled with his wife, but he never talked to her. He never had time to talk, he was so taken up with speaking. She, poor lady, was not unhappy. She had all that money could give her. She would probably live to be a peeress, and she really thought Sir Abraham the best of husbands. Sir Abraham was a man of wit, and sparkled among the brightest at the dinner tables of political grandees. Indeed, he always sparkled, whether in society, in the House of Commons, or the courts of law. Coruscations flew from him, glittering sparkles as from hot steel, but no heat. No cold heart was ever cheered by warmth from him. No unhappy soul ever dropped a portion of its burden at his door. With him, success alone was praiseworthy, and he knew none so successful as himself. No one had thrust him forward. No powerful friends had pushed him along on his road to power. No, he was Attorney General, and would in all human probability be Lord Chancellor, by sheer dint of his own industry and his own talent. Who else in all the world rose so high with so little help? A premier, indeed? Who had ever been premier without mighty friends? An archbishop? Yes, the son or grandson of a great noble, or else probably his tutor. But he, Sir Abraham, had had no mighty lord at his back.
His father had been a country apothecary, his mother a farmer's daughter. Why should he respect any but himself? And so he glitters along through the world, the brightest among the bright, and when his glitter is gone, and he is gathered to his fathers, no eye will be dim with a tear, no heart will mourn for its lost friend. "And so, Mr. Warden," said Sir Abraham, "all our trouble about this lawsuit is at an end." Mr. Harding said he hoped so, but he didn't at all understand what Sir Abraham meant. Sir Abraham, with all his sharpness, could not have looked into his heart and read his intentions. "All over. You need trouble yourself no further about it. Of course they must pay the costs, and the absolute expense to you and Dr Grantly will be trifling, that is, compared with what it might have been if it had been continued." "I fear I don't quite understand you, Sir Abraham. Don't you know that their attorneys have noticed us, that they have withdrawn the suit?" Mr Harding explained to the lawyer that he knew nothing of this, although he had heard in a roundabout way that such an intention had been talked of; and he also at length succeeded in making Sir Abraham understand that even this did not satisfy him. The Attorney General stood up, put his hands into his breeches pockets, and raised his eyebrows, as Mr Harding proceeded to detail the grievance from which he now wished to rid himself. "I know I have no right to trouble you personally with this matter, but as it is of most vital importance to me, as all my happiness is concerned in it, I thought I might venture to seek your advice." Sir Abraham bowed and declared his clients were entitled to the best advice he could give them, particularly a client so respectable in every way as the warden of Barchester Hospital. A spoken word, Sir Abraham, is often of more value than volumes of written advice. The truth is, I am ill satisfied with this matter as it stands at present. I cannot help seeing that the affairs of the hospital are not arranged according to the will of the founder. None of such institutions are, Mr Harding, nor can they be. The altered circumstances in which we live do not admit of it. Quite true, that is quite true, but I can't see that those altered circumstances give me a right to 800 a year. I don't know whether I ever read John Hiram's will, but were I to read it now, I could not understand it. What I want you, Sir Abraham, to tell me is this: am I, as warden, legally and distinctly entitled to the proceeds of the property after the due maintenance of the 12 bedesmen? Sir Abraham declared that he couldn't exactly say in so many words that Mr Harding was legally entitled to, etc., 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 and ended in expressing a strong opinion that it would be madness to raise any further question on the matter, as the suit was to be, nay, was abandoned. Mr Harding, seated in his chair, began to play a slow tune on an imaginary violoncello. "Nay, my dear sir," continued the Attorney General, "there is no further ground for any question. I don't see that you have the power of raising it." "I can resign,"
said Mr Harding, slowly playing away with his right hand, as though the bow were beneath the chair in which he was sitting.
"What, throw it up altogether?" said the attorney general, gazing with utter astonishment at his client.
"Did you see those articles in the Jupiter?" said Mr Harding piteously, appealing to the sympathy of the lawyer.
Sir Abraham said he had seen them. This poor little clergyman, cowed into such an act of extreme weakness by a newspaper article, was to Sir Abraham so contemptible an object that he hardly knew how to talk to him as to a rational being. "Hadn't you better wait," said he, "till Dr Grantly is in town with you? Wouldn't it be better to postpone any serious step till you can consult with him?" Mr Harding declared vehemently that he could not wait, and Sir Abraham began seriously to doubt his sanity. "Of course," said the latter, "if you have private means sufficient for your wants, and if this—"
"I haven't a sixpence, Sir Abraham," said the warden.
"God bless me! Why, Mr Harding, how do you mean to live?"
Mr Harding proceeded to explain to the man of law that he meant to keep his precentorship, that was £80 a year, and also that he meant to fall back upon his own little living of Crabtree, which was another £80; that, to be sure, the duties of the two were hardly compatible, but perhaps he might effect an exchange; and then, recollecting that the attorney general would hardly care to hear how the service of a cathedral church is divided among the minor canons, stopped short in his explanations. Sir Abraham listened in pitying wonder. "I really think, Mr Harding, you had better wait for the archdeacon. This is a most serious step, one for which, in my opinion, there is not the slightest necessity; and as you have done me the honour of asking my advice, I must implore you to do nothing without the approval of your friends. A man is never the best judge of his own position." "A man is the best judge of what he feels himself. I'd sooner beg my bread till my death than read such another article as those two that have appeared, and feel as I do that the writer has truth on his side."
"Have you not a daughter, Mr Harding, an unmarried daughter?"
"I have," said he, now standing also, but still playing away on his fiddle with his hand behind his back. "I have, Sir Abraham, and she and I are completely agreed on this subject."
"Pray excuse me, Mr Harding, if what I say seems impertinent, but surely it is you that should be prudent on her behalf. She is young, and does not know the meaning of living on an income of £160 a year. On her account, give up this idea. Believe me, it is sheer quixotism." The warden walked away to the window, and then back to his chair, and then, irresolute what to say, took another turn to the window. The attorney general was really extremely patient, but he was beginning to think that the interview had been long enough. "But if this income be not justly mine, what if she and I have both to beg?" said the warden at last, sharply, and in a voice so different from that he had hitherto used that Sir Abraham was startled. If so, it would be better to beg. My dear sir, nobody now questions its justness." "Yes, Sir Abraham, one does question it. The most important of all witnesses against me. I question it myself. My God knows whether or not I love my daughter, but I would sooner that she and I should both beg than that she should live in comfort on money which is truly the property of the poor. It may seem strange to you, Sir Abraham, it is strange to myself, that I should have been 10 years in that happy home, and not have thought of these things till they were so roughly dinned into my ears. I cannot boast of my conscience when it required the violence of a public newspaper to awaken it; but now that it is awake, I must obey it. When I came here, I did not know that the suit was withdrawn by Mr Bold, and my object was to beg you to abandon my defence. As there is no action, there can be no defence; but it is at any rate as well that you should know that from tomorrow I shall cease to be the warden of the hospital. My friends and I differ on this subject, Sir Abraham, and that adds much to my sorrow, but it cannot be helped." And as he finished what he had to say, he played up such a tune as never before had graced the chambers of any attorney general. He was standing up, gallantly fronting Sir Abraham, and his right arm passed with bold and rapid sweeps before him, as though he were embracing some huge instrument which allowed him to stand thus erect; and with the fingers of his left hand he stopped, with preternatural velocity, a multitude of strings, which ranged from the top of his collar to the bottom of the lappet of his coat. Sir Abraham listened and looked in wonder. As he had never before seen Mr Harding, the meaning of these wild gesticulations was lost upon him; but he perceived that the gentleman, who had a few minutes since been so subdued as to be unable to speak without hesitation, was now impassioned, nay, almost violent. "You'll sleep on this, Mr Harding, and tomorrow—" "I have done more than sleep upon it," said the warden. "I have lain awake upon it, and that night after night. I found I could not sleep upon it. Now I hope to do so." The attorney general had no answer to make to this, so he expressed a quiet hope that whatever settlement was finally made would be satisfactory, and Mr Harding withdrew, thanking the great man for his kind attention. Mr Harding was sufficiently satisfied with the interview to feel a glow of comfort as he descended into the small old square of Lincoln's Inn. It was a calm, bright, beautiful night, and by the light of the moon even the chapel of Lincoln's Inn, and the sombre row of chambers which surround the quadrangle, looked well. He stood still a moment to collect his thoughts and reflect on what he had done and was about to do. He knew that the attorney general regarded him as little better than a fool, but that he did not mind. He and the attorney general had not much in common between them. He knew also that others whom he did care about would think so too, but Eleanor, he was sure, would exult in what he had done, and the bishop, he trusted, would sympathize with him. In the meantime he had to meet the archdeacon, and so he walked slowly down Chancery Lane and along Fleet Street, feeling sure that his work for the night was not yet over. When he reached the hotel, he rang the bell quietly, and with a palpitating heart he almost longed to escape round the corner and delay the coming storm by a further walk round St Paul's churchyard. But he heard the slow creaking shoes of the old waiter approaching, and he stood his ground manfully. End of chapter 17. Recording by Nick Whitley, Purley, United Kingdom. Chapter 18 of The Warden by Anthony Trollope. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Nick Whitley, Purley, United Kingdom. Chapter 18. The Warden is very obstinate.
Dr Grantly is here, sir,
greeted his ears before the door was well open.
and Mrs Grantly. They have a sitting room above, and are waiting up for you.
There was something in the tone of the man's voice which seemed to indicate that even he looked upon the warden as a runaway schoolboy just recaptured by his guardian, and that he pitied the culprit, though he could not but be horrified at the crime. The warden endeavoured to appear unconcerned as he said, "Oh, indeed, I'll go upstairs at once," but he failed signally. There was perhaps a ray of comfort in the presence of his married daughter, that is to say, of comparative comfort, seeing that his son-in-law was there. But how much would he have preferred that they should both have been safe at Plumstead Episcopi? However, upstairs he went, the waiter slowly preceding him, and on the door being opened, the archdeacon was discovered standing in the middle of the room, erect indeed as usual, but oh, how sorrowful! And on the dingy sofa behind him reclined his patient wife. "Papa, I thought you were never coming back," said the lady. "It's 12 o'clock."
"Yes, my dear," said the warden. "The attorney general named 10 for my meeting. To be sure, 10 is late, but what could I do, you know? Great men will have their own way." And he gave his daughter a kiss, and shook hands with the doctor, and again tried to look unconcerned. "And you have absolutely been with the attorney general?" asked the archdeacon. Mr Harding signified that he had. "Good heavens, how unfortunate!" And the archdeacon raised his huge hands in the manner in which his friends are so accustomed to see him express disapprobation and astonishment. "What will Sir Abraham think of it? Did you not know that it is not customary for clients to go direct to their counsel?" "Isn't it?" asked the warden innocently. "Well, at any rate, I've done it now." Sir Abraham didn't seem to think it so very strange. The archdeacon gave a sigh that would have moved a man of war. "But, papa, what did you say to Sir Abraham?" asked the lady. "I asked him, my dear, to explain John Hiram's will to me. He couldn't explain it in the only way which would have satisfied me, and so I resigned the wardenship." "Resigned it!" said the archdeacon in a solemn voice, sad and low, but yet sufficiently audible, a sort of whisper that Macready would have envied, and the galleries have applauded with a couple of rounds. "Resigned it! Good heavens!" And the dignitary of the church sank back horrified into a horsehair armchair. "At least I told Sir Abraham that I would resign, and of course I must now do so." "Not at all," said the archdeacon, catching a ray of hope. Nothing that you say in such a way to your own counsel can be in any way binding on you. Of course you were there to ask his advice. I'm sure Sir Abraham did not advise any such step." Mr Harding could not say that he had. "I am sure he disadvised you from it," continued the reverend cross-examiner. Mr Harding could not deny this. "I'm sure Sir Abraham must have advised you to consult your friends." To this proposition also Mr Harding was obliged to assent. "Then your threat of resignation amounts to nothing, and we are just where we were before." Mr Harding was now standing on the rug, moving uneasily from one foot to the other. He made no distinct answer to the archdeacon's last proposition, for his mind was chiefly engaged on thinking how he could escape to bed. That his resignation was a thing finally fixed on, a fact all but completed, was not in his mind a matter of any doubt. He knew his own weakness, he knew how prone he was to be led, but he was not weak enough to give way now, to go back from the position to which his conscience had driven him, after having purposely come to London to declare his determination. He did not in the least doubt his resolution, but he greatly doubted his power of defending it against his son-in-law. "You must be very tired, Susan," said he. "Wouldn't you like to go to bed?" But Susan didn't want to go till her husband went. She had an idea that her papa might be bullied if she were away. She wasn't tired at all, or at least she said so. The archdeacon was pacing the room, expressing by certain nods of his head his opinion of the utter fatuity of his father-in-law. "Why," at last he said, and angels might have blushed at the rebuke expressed in his tone and emphasis, "why did you go off from Barchester so suddenly? Why did you take such a step without giving us notice, after what had passed at the palace?" The warden hung his head and made no reply. He could not condescend to say that he had not intended to give his son-in-law the slip, but as he had not the courage to avow it, he said nothing. "Papa has been too much for you," said the lady. The archdeacon took another turn, and again ejaculated, "Good heavens!" this time in a very low whisper, but still audible. "I think I'll go to bed," said the warden, taking up a side candle. "At any rate you'll promise me to take no further step without consultation?" said the archdeacon. Mr Harding made no answer, but slowly proceeded to light his candle. "Of course," continued the other, "such a declaration as that you made to Sir Abraham means nothing. Come, warden, promise me this. The whole affair, you see, is already settled, and that with very little trouble or expense. Bold has been compelled to abandon his action, and all you have to do is to remain quiet at the hospital." Mr Harding still made no reply, but looked meekly into his son-in-law's face. The archdeacon thought he knew his father-in-law, but he was mistaken. He thought that he had already talked over a vacillating man to resign his promise. "Come," said he, "promise Susan to give up this idea of resigning the wardenship." The warden looked at his daughter,
thinking probably at the moment that if Eleanor were contented with him, he need not so much regard his other child, and said, "I am sure Susan will not ask me to break my word, or to do what I know to be wrong."
"Papa," said she, "it would be madness in you to throw up your preferment. What are you to live on?"
"God, that feeds the young ravens, will take care of me also," said Mr Harding, with a smile, as though afraid of giving offence by making his reference to Scripture too solemn.
Pish!
said the archdeacon, turning away rapidly.
If the ravens persisted in refusing the food prepared for them, they wouldn't be fed.
A clergyman generally dislikes to be met in argument by any scriptural quotation. He feels as affronted as a doctor does when recommended by an old woman to take some favourite dose, or as a lawyer when an unprofessional man attempts to put him down by a quibble.
"I shall have the living of Crabtree," modestly suggested the warden. £80 a year,
sneered the archdeacon.
"And the precentorship?"
said the father-in-law.
"It goes with the wardenship,"
said the son-in-law.
Mr Harding was prepared to argue this point, and began to do so, but Dr Grantly stopped him. "My dear warden," said he, "this is all nonsense. £80 or 160 makes very little difference. You can't live on it. You can't ruin Eleanor's prospects for ever. In point of fact, you can't resign. The bishop wouldn't accept it. The whole thing is settled. What I now want to do is to prevent any inconvenient tittle-tattle, any more newspaper articles. That's what I want too," said the warden. "And to prevent that," continued the other, "we mustn't let any talk of resignation get abroad. But I shall resign," said the warden, very, very meekly. "Good heavens, Susan, my dear, what can I say to him?"
"But, papa," said Mrs Grantly, getting up and putting her arm through that of her father, "what is Eleanor to do if you throw away your income?"
A hot tear stood in each of the warden's eyes as he looked round upon his married daughter. Why should one sister who was so rich predict poverty for another?
Some such idea as this was on his mind, but he gave no utterance to it. Then he thought of the pelican feeding its young with blood from its own breast, but he gave no utterance to that either. And then of Eleanor waiting for him at home, waiting to congratulate him on the end of all his trouble. "Think of Eleanor, papa," said Mrs Grantly.
"I do think of her,"
said her father. "And you will not do this rash thing?" The lady was really moved beyond her usual calm composure.
"It can never be rash to do right," said he. "I shall certainly resign this wardenship."
"Then, Mr Harding, there is nothing before you but ruin," said the archdeacon, now moved beyond all endurance. "Ruin both for you and Eleanor. How do you mean to pay the monstrous expenses of this action?" Mrs Grantly suggested that, as the action was abandoned, the costs would not be heavy. "Indeed they will, my dear," continued he. "One cannot have the attorney general up at 12 o'clock at night for nothing. But of course your father has not thought of this."
"I will sell my furniture," said the warden.
"Furniture!" ejaculated the other, with a most powerful sneer. "Come, archdeacon," said the lady, "we needn't mind that at present.
You know you never expected papa to pay the costs."
"Such absurdity is enough to provoke Job," said the archdeacon, marching quickly up and down the room. "Your father is like a child. £800 a year, 880, with the house, with nothing to do, the very place for him. And to throw that up because some scoundrel writes an article in a newspaper! Well, I have done my duty. If he chooses to ruin his child, I cannot help it." And he stood still at the fireplace and looked at himself in a dingy mirror which stood on the chimney piece. There was a pause for about a minute, and then the warden, finding that nothing else was coming, lighted his candle and quietly said, "Good night."
"Good night, papa," said the lady.
And so the warden retired, but as he closed the door behind him, he heard the well-known ejaculation, slower, lower, more solemn, more ponderous than ever: "Good heavens!"
End of chapter 18. Recording by Nick Whitley, Purley, United Kingdom. Chapter 19 of The Warden, by Anthony Trollope. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Nick Whitley, Purley, United Kingdom. Chapter 19. The Warden resigns. The party met the next morning at breakfast, and a very sombre affair it was, very unlike the breakfasts at Plumstead Episcopi. There were 3 thin, small, dry bits of bacon, each an inch long, served up under a huge old plated cover. There were 4 3-cornered bits of dry toast, and 4 square bits of buttered toast. There was a loaf of bread, and some oily-looking butter, and on the sideboard there were the remains of a cold shoulder of mutton. The archdeacon, however, had not come up from his rectory to St Paul's churchyard to enjoy himself, and therefore nothing was said of the scanty fare. The guests were as sorry as the viands. Hardly anything was said over the breakfast table. The archdeacon munched his toast in ominous silence, turning over bitter thoughts in his deep mind. The warden tried to talk to his daughter, and she tried to answer him, but they both failed. There were no feelings at present in common between them. The warden was thinking only of getting back to Barchester, and calculating whether the archdeacon would expect him to wait for him, and Mrs Grantly was preparing herself for a grand attack, which she was to make on her father, as agreed upon between herself and her husband during their curtain confabulation of that morning. When the waiter had creaked out of the room with the last of the teacups, the archdeacon got up and went to the window as though to admire the view. The room looked out on a narrow passage which runs from St Paul's churchyard to Paternoster Row, and Dr Grantly patiently perused the names of the 3 shopkeepers whose doors were in view. The warden still kept his seat at the table and examined the pattern of the tablecloth, and Mrs Grantly, seating herself on the sofa, began to knit. After a while the warden pulled his Bradshaw out of his pocket and began laboriously to consult it. There was a train for Barchester at 10 a.m. That was out of the question, for it was nearly 10 already.
another at 3 p.m., another the night mail train at 9 p.m. The 3 o'clock train would take him home to tea, and would suit very well. "My dear," said he, "I think I shall go back home at 3 o'clock to day. I shall get home at 8:30. I don't think there's anything to keep me in London. The archdeacon and I return by the early train to morrow, papa. Won't you wait and go back with us?" "Why, Eleanor will expect me to night, and I've so much to do, and—" "Much to do!" said the archdeacon sotto voce, but the warden heard him. "You'd better wait for us, papa." "Thank ye, my dear. I think I'll go this afternoon." The tamest animal will turn when driven too hard, and even Mr Harding was beginning to fight for his own way. "I suppose you won't be back before 3?" said the lady, addressing her husband. "I must leave this at 2, said the warden. "Quite out of the question," said the archdeacon, answering his wife, and still reading the shopkeepers' names. "I don't suppose I shall be back till 5. There was another long pause, during which Mr Harding continued to study his Bradshaw. "I must go to Cox and Cummins," said the archdeacon at last. "Oh, to Cox and Cummins," said the warden. It was quite a matter of indifference to him where his son-in-law went. The names of Cox and Cummins had now no interest in his ears. What had he to do with Cox and Cummins further, having already had his suit finally adjudicated upon in a court of conscience, a judgment without power of appeal, fully registered, and the matter settled so that all the lawyers in London could not disturb it? The archdeacon could go to Cox and Cummins, could remain there all day in anxious discussion, but what might be said there was no longer matter of interest to him, who was so soon to lay aside the name of warden of Barchester Hospital. The archdeacon took up his shining new clerical hat, and put on his black new clerical gloves, and looked heavy, respectable, decorous, and opulent, a decided clergyman of the Church of England, every inch of him. "I suppose I shall see you at Barchester the day after tomorrow," said he. The warden supposed he would. "I must once more beseech you to take no further steps till you see my father. If you owe me nothing," and the archdeacon looked as though he thought a great deal were due to him, "at least you owe so much to my father." And without waiting for a reply, Dr Grantly wended his way to Cox and Cummins. Mrs Grantly waited till the last fall of her husband's foot was heard, as he turned out of the court into St Paul's churchyard, and then commenced her task of talking her father over. "Papa," she began, "this is a most serious business." "Indeed it is," said the warden, ringing the bell. "I greatly feel the distress of mind you must have endured." "I am sure you do, my dear." And he ordered the waiter to bring him pen, ink, and paper. "Are you going to write, papa?" "Yes, my dear, I am going to write my resignation to the bishop." "Pray, pray, papa, put it off till our return. Pray put it off till you have seen the bishop. Dear papa, for my sake, for Eleanor's." "It is for your sake and Eleanor's that I do this. I hope at least that my children may never have to be ashamed of their father." "How can you talk about shame, papa? and she stopped while the waiter creaked in with the paper, and then slowly creaked out again.
How can you talk about shame? You know what all your friends think about this question. The warden spread his paper on the table, placed it on the meagre blotting book which the hotel afforded, and sat himself down to write. "You won't refuse me one request, papa?" continued his daughter. "You won't refuse to delay your letter for 2 short days? 2 days can make no possible difference."
"My dear," said he naively, "if I waited till I got to Barchester, I might perhaps be prevented."
"But surely you would not wish to offend the bishop?" said she.
"God forbid. The bishop is not apt to take offence, and knows me too well to take in bad part anything that I may be called on to do."
"But, papa—"
"Susan," said he, "my mind on this subject is made up. It is not without much repugnance that I act in opposition to the advice of such men as Sir Abraham Haphazard and the archdeacon; but in this matter I can take no advice. I cannot alter the resolution to which I have come."
"But 2 days, papa."
"No, nor can I delay it. You may add to my present unhappiness by pressing me, but you cannot change my purpose. It will be a comfort to me if you will let the matter rest."
And dipping his pen into the inkstand, he fixed his eyes intently on the paper. There was something in his manner which taught his daughter to perceive that he was in earnest. She had at one time ruled supreme in her father's house, but she knew that there were moments when, mild and meek as he was, he would have his way, and the present was an occasion of the sort. She returned therefore to her knitting, and very shortly after left the room. The warden was now at liberty to compose his letter, and as it was characteristic of the man, it shall be given at full length. The official letter, which, when written, seemed to him to be too formally cold to be sent alone to so dear a friend, was accompanied by a private note, and both are here inserted. The letter of resignation ran as follows: "Chapter Hotel, St Paul's, London, August 1800. My Lord Bishop, it is with the greatest pain that I feel myself constrained to resign into your lordship's hands the wardenship of the hospital at Barchester, which you so kindly conferred upon me now nearly 12 years since. I need not explain the circumstances which have made this step appear necessary to me. You are aware that a question has arisen as to the right of the warden to the income which has been allotted to the wardenship. It has seemed to me that this right is not well made out, and I hesitate to incur the risk of taking an income to which my legal claim appears doubtful. The office of precentor of the cathedral is, as your lordship is aware, joined to that of the warden. That is to say, the precentor has for many years been the warden of the hospital. There is, however, nothing to make the junction of the two offices necessary, and unless you or the dean and chapter object to such an arrangement, I would wish to keep the precentorship. The income of this office will now be necessary to me. Indeed, I do not know why I should be ashamed to say that I should have difficulty in supporting myself without it. Your lordship, and such others as you may please to consult on the matter, will at once see that my resignation of the wardenship
need offer not the slightest bar to its occupation by another person. I am thought in the wrong by all those whom I have consulted in the matter. I have very little but an inward and an unguided conviction of my own to bring me to this step, and I shall indeed be hurt to find that any slur is thrown on the preferment which your kindness bestowed on me by my resignation of it. I, at any rate, for one, shall look on any successor whom you may appoint as enjoying a clerical situation of the highest respectability, and one to which your lordship's nomination gives an indefeasible right. I cannot finish this official letter without again thanking your lordship for all your great kindness, and I beg to subscribe myself your lordship's most obedient servant, Septimus Harding, Warden of Barchester Hospital and Precentor of the Cathedral.
He then wrote the following private note:
My dear Bishop, I cannot send you the accompanying official letter without a warmer expression of thanks for all your kindness than would befit a document which may, to a certain degree, be made public. You, I know, will understand the feeling, and perhaps pity the weakness which makes me resign the hospital. I am not made of calibre strong enough to withstand public attack. Were I convinced that I stood on ground perfectly firm, that I was certainly justified in taking 800 a year under Hiram's will, I should feel bound by duty to retain the position, however unendurable might be the nature of the assault. But as I do not feel this conviction, I cannot believe that you will think me wrong in what I am doing. I had at one time an idea of keeping only some moderate portion of the income, perhaps 300 a year, and of remitting the remainder to the trustees. But it occurred to me, and I think with reason, that by so doing I should place my successors in an invidious position, and greatly damage your patronage. My dear friend, let me have a line from you to say that you do not blame me for what I am doing, and that the officiating vicar of Crabtree Parva will be the same to you as the warden of the hospital. I am very anxious about the precentorship. The archdeacon thinks it must go with the wardenship. I think not, and that having it I cannot be ousted. I will, however, be guided by you and the dean. No other duty will suit me so well, or come so much within my power of adequate performance. I thank you from my heart for the preferment which I am now giving up, and for all your kindness, and am, dear Bishop, now, as always, yours most sincerely, Septimus Harding. London, August 1800. Having written these letters, and made a copy of the former one for the benefit of the archdeacon, Mr Harding, whom we must now cease to call the warden, he having designated himself so for the last time, found that it was nearly 2 o'clock, and that he must prepare for his journey. Yes, from this time he never again admitted the name by which he had been so familiarly known, and in which, to tell the truth, he had rejoiced. The love of titles is common to all men, and a vicar or fellow is as pleased at becoming Mr Archdeacon or Mr Provost as a lieutenant at getting his captaincy, or a city tallow chandler in becoming Sir John on the occasion of a queen's visit to a new bridge. But warden he was no longer, and the name of precentor, though the office was to him so dear,
confers in itself no sufficient distinction. Our friend, therefore, again became Mr Harding. Mrs Grantly had gone out. He had therefore no one to delay him by further entreaties to postpone his journey. He had soon arranged his bag and paid his bill, and leaving a note for his daughter, in which he put the copy of his official letter, he got into a cab and drove away to the station with something of triumph in his heart. Had he not cause for triumph? Had he not been supremely successful? Had he not, for the first time in his life, held his own purpose against that of his son-in-law, and manfully combated against great odds, against the archdeacon's wife as well as the archdeacon? Had he not gained a great victory, and was it not fit that he should step into his cab with triumph? He had not told Eleanor when he would return, but she was on the look out for him by every train by which he could arrive, and the pony carriage was at the Barchester station when the train drew up at the platform. "My dear," said he, sitting beside her, as she steered her little vessel to one side of the road to make room for the clattering omnibus as they passed from the station into the town, "I hope you'll be able to feel a proper degree of respect for the Vicar of Crabtree." "Dear papa," said she, "I am so glad." There was great comfort in returning home to that pleasant house, though he was to leave it so soon, and in discussing with his daughter all that he had done, and all that he had to do. It must take some time to get out of one house into another. The curate at Crabtree could not be abolished under 6 months, that is, unless other provision could be made for him. And then the furniture, the most of that must be sold to pay Sir Abraham Haphazard for sitting up till 12 at night. Mr Harding was strangely ignorant as to lawyers' bills. He had no idea from £20 to 2000 as to the sum in which he was indebted for legal assistance. True, he had called in no lawyer himself. True, he had been no consenting party to the employment of either Cox and Cummins or Sir Abraham. He had never been consulted on such matters. The archdeacon had managed all this himself, never for a moment suspecting that Mr Harding would take upon him to end the matter in a way of his own. Had the lawyer's bills been £10,000, Mr Harding could not have helped it, but he was not on that account disposed to dispute his own liability. The question never occurred to him, but it did occur to him that he had very little money at his banker's, that he could receive nothing further from the hospital, and that the sale of the furniture was his only resource. "Not all, papa," said Eleanor pleadingly. "Not quite all, my dear," said he. "That is, if we can help it. We must have a little at Crabtree, but it can only be a little. We must put a bold front on it, Nelly. It isn't easy to come down from affluence to poverty." And so they planned their future mode of life. The father taking comfort from the reflection that his daughter would soon be freed from it, and she resolving that her father would soon have in her own house a ready means of escape from the solitude of the Crabtree vicarage. When the archdeacon left his wife and father-in-law at the chapter coffee house to go to Messrs Cox and Cummins, he had no very defined idea of what he had to do when he got there. Gentlemen, when at law, or in any way engaged in matters requiring legal assistance, are very apt to go to their lawyers without much absolute necessity. Gentlemen, when doing so,
are apt to describe such attendance as quite compulsory and very disagreeable. The lawyers, on the other hand, do not at all see the necessity, though they quite agree as to the disagreeable nature of the visit. Gentlemen, when so engaged, are usually somewhat gravelled at finding nothing to say to their learned friends. They generally talk a little politics, a little weather, ask some few foolish questions about their suit, and then withdraw, having passed half an hour in a small dingy waiting room, in company with some junior assistant clerk, and 10 minutes with the members of the firm. The business is then over for which the gentleman has come up to London, probably a distance of 150 miles. To be sure, he goes to the play, and dines at his friend's club, and has a bachelor's liberty and a bachelor's recreation for 3 or 4 days, and he could not probably plead the desire of such gratifications as a reason to his wife for a trip to London. Married ladies, when your husbands find they are positively obliged to attend their legal advisers, the nature of the duty to be performed is generally of this description.
The archdeacon would not have dreamt of leaving London without going to Cox and Cummins,
and yet he had nothing to say to them. The game was up. He plainly saw that Mr Harding in this matter was not to be moved. His only remaining business on this head was to pay the bill and have done with it. And I think it may be taken for granted that whatever the cause may be that takes a gentleman to a lawyer's chambers, he never goes there to pay his bill. Dr Grantly, however, in the eyes of Messrs Cox and Cummins, represented the spiritualities of the diocese of Barchester, as Mr Chadwick did the temporalities, and was therefore too great a man to undergo the half hour in the clerk's room. It will not be necessary that we should listen to the notes of sorrow in which the archdeacon bewailed to Mr Cox the weakness of his father-in-law and the end of all their hopes of triumph. Nor need we repeat the various exclamations of surprise with which the mournful intelligence was received. No tragedy occurred, though Mr Cox, a short and somewhat bull-necked man, was very near a fit of apoplexy when he first attempted to ejaculate that fatal word, resign. Over and over again did Mr Cox attempt to enforce on the archdeacon the propriety of urging on Mr Warden the madness of the deed he was about to do. 800 a year, said Mr Cox. And nothing whatever to do, said Mr Cummins, who had joined the conference. No private fortune, I believe, said Mr Cox. Not a shilling, said Mr Cummins, in a very low voice, shaking his head. I never heard of such a case in all my experience, said Mr Cox. 800 a year, and as nice a house as any gentleman could wish to hang up his hat in, said Mr Cummins. And an unmarried daughter, I believe, said Mr Cox, with much moral seriousness in his tone. The archdeacon only sighed as each separate wail was uttered, and shook his head, signifying that the fatuity of some people was past belief. I'll tell you what he might do, said Mr Cummins, brightening up. I'll tell you how you might save it. Let him exchange. Exchange where? Said the archdeacon. Exchange for a living. There's Quiverful of Puddingdale. He has 12 children, and would be delighted to get the hospital. To be sure, Puddingdale is only 400, but that would be saving something out of the fire. Mr Harding would have a curate and still keep 300 or 350. The archdeacon opened his ears and listened.
he really thought the scheme might do. The newspapers, continued Mr. Cummins, might hammer away at Quiverful every day for the next 6 months without his minding them. The archdeacon took up his hat and returned to his hotel, thinking the matter over deeply. At any rate, he would sound Quiverful. A man with 12 children would do much to double his income.
End of chapter 19. Recording by Nick Whitley, Purley, United Kingdom. Chapter 20 of The Warden by Anthony Trollope. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Nick Whitley, Purley, United Kingdom. Chapter 20. Farewell. On the morning after Mr. Harding's return home, he received a note from the bishop, full of affection, condolence, and praise. "Pray come to me at once," wrote the bishop, "that we may see what had better be done. As to the hospital, I will not say a word to dissuade you, but I don't like your going to Crabtree. At any rate, come to me at once." Mr. Harding did go to him at once, and long and confidential was the consultation between the two old friends. There they sat together the whole long day, plotting to get the better of the archdeacon, and to carry out little schemes of their own, which they knew would be opposed by the whole weight of his authority. The bishop's first idea was, that Mr. Harding, if left to himself, would certainly starve. Not in the figurative sense in which so many of our ladies and gentlemen do starve on incomes from 1 to 500 a year. Not that he would be starved as regarded dress coats, port wine, and pocket money, but that he would positively perish of inanition for want of bread. How is a man to live when he gives up all his income? Said the bishop to himself. And then the good-natured little man began to consider how his friend might be best rescued from a death so horrid and painful. His first proposition to Mr. Harding was, that they should live together at the palace. He, the bishop, positively assured Mr. Harding that he wanted another resident chaplain, not a young working chaplain, but a steady middle-aged chaplain, one who would dine and drink a glass of wine with him, talk about the archdeacon, and poke the fire. The bishop did not positively name all these duties, but he gave Mr. Harding to understand that such would be the nature of the service required. It was not without much difficulty that Mr. Harding made his friend see that this would not suit him, that he could not throw up the bishop's preferment and then come and hang on at the bishop's table, that he could not allow people to say of him that it was an easy matter to abandon his own income, as he was able to sponge on that of another person. He succeeded, however, in explaining that the plan would not do, and then the bishop brought forward another which he had in his sleeve. He, the bishop, had in his will left certain moneys to Mr. Harding's 2 daughters, imagining that Mr. Harding would himself want no such assistance during his own lifetime. This legacy amounted to £3,000 each, duty free, and he now pressed it as a gift on his friend. "The girls, you know," said he, "will have it just the same when you're gone, and they won't want it sooner. And as for the interest during my lifetime, it isn't worth talking about. I have more than enough." With much difficulty and heartfelt sorrow, Mr. Harding refused also this offer. No, his wish was to support himself, however poorly,
not to be supported on the charity of any one.
It was hard to make the bishop understand this. It was hard to make him comprehend that the only real favour he could confer was the continuation of his independent friendship. But at last even this was done. "At any rate," thought the bishop, "he will come and dine with me from time to time, and if he be absolutely starving, I shall see it." Touching the precentorship, the bishop was clearly of opinion that it could be held without the other situation, an opinion from which no one differed, and it was therefore soon settled among all the parties concerned that Mr Harding should still be the precentor of the cathedral. On the day following Mr Harding's return, the archdeacon reached Plumstead full of Mr Cummins's scheme regarding Puddingdale and Mr Quiverful. On the very next morning he drove over to Puddingdale, and obtained the full consent of the wretched clerical Priam, who was endeavouring to feed his poor Hecuba and a dozen of Hectors on the small proceeds of his ecclesiastical kingdom.
Mr Quiverful had no doubts as to the legal rights of the warden. His conscience would be quite clear as to accepting the income; and as to the Jupiter, he begged to assure the archdeacon that he was quite indifferent to any emanations from the profane portion of the periodical press.
Having so far succeeded, he next sounded the bishop; but here he was astonished by most unexpected resistance. The bishop did not think it would do. Not do? Why not? And seeing that his father was not shaken, he repeated the question in a severer form. Why not do, my lord? His lordship looked very unhappy, and shuffled about in his chair, but still didn't give way. He thought Puddingdale wouldn't do for Mr Harding. It was too far from Barchester. Oh, of course he'll have a curate. The bishop also thought that Mr Quiverful wouldn't do for the hospital. Such an exchange wouldn't look well at such a time; and when pressed harder, he declared he didn't think Mr Harding would accept of Puddingdale under any circumstances. How is he to live? Demanded the archdeacon. The bishop, with tears in his eyes, declared that he had not the slightest conception how life was to be sustained within him at all. The archdeacon then left his father and went down to the hospital, but Mr Harding wouldn't listen at all to the Puddingdale scheme. To his eyes it had no attraction. It savoured of simony, and was likely to bring down upon him harder and more deserved strictures than any he had yet received. He positively declined to become vicar of Puddingdale under any circumstances. The archdeacon waxed wroth, talked big, and looked bigger. He said something about dependence and beggary, spoke of the duty every man was under to earn his bread, made passing allusions to the follies of youth and waywardness of age, as though Mr Harding were afflicted by both, and ended by declaring that he had done. He felt that he had left no stone unturned to arrange matters on the best and easiest footing, that he had in fact so arranged them, that he had so managed that there was no further need of any anxiety in the matter. And how had he been paid? His advice had been systematically rejected. He had been not only slighted, but distrusted and avoided. He and his measures had been utterly thrown over, as had been Sir Abraham,
who, he had reason to know, was much pained at what had occurred. He now found it was useless to interfere any further, and he should retire. If any further assistance were required from him, he would probably be called on, and should be again happy to come forward. And so he left the hospital, and has not since entered it from that day to this. And here we must take leave of Archdeacon Grantly. We fear that he is represented in these pages as being worse than he is, but we have had to do with his foibles and not with his virtues. We have seen only the weak side of the man, and have lacked the opportunity of bringing him forward on his strong ground, that he is a man somewhat too fond of his own way, and not sufficiently scrupulous in his manner of achieving it, his best friends cannot deny. That he is bigoted in favour not so much of his doctrines as of his cloth is also true; and it is true that the possession of a large income is a desire that sits near his heart. Nevertheless, the archdeacon is a gentleman and a man of conscience. He spends his money liberally, and does the work he has to do with the best of his ability. He improves the tone of society of those among whom he lives. His aspirations are of a healthy, if not of the highest kind. Though never an austere man, he upholds propriety of conduct both by example and precept. He is generous to the poor and hospitable to the rich. In matters of religion he is sincere, and yet no Pharisee. He is in earnest, and yet no fanatic. On the whole, the Archdeacon of Barchester is a man doing more good than harm, a man to be furthered and supported, though perhaps also to be controlled, and it is a matter of regret to us that the course of our narrative has required that we should see more of his weakness than his strength. Mr Harding allowed himself no rest till everything was prepared for his departure from the hospital. It may be as well to mention that he was not driven to the stern necessity of selling all his furniture. He had been quite in earnest in his intention to do so, but it was soon made known to him that the claims of Messrs Cox and Cummins made no such step obligatory. The archdeacon had thought it wise to make use of the threat of the lawyer's bill to frighten his father-in-law into compliance, but he had no intention to saddle Mr Harding with costs which had been incurred by no means exclusively for his benefit. The amount of the bill was added to the diocesan account, and was in fact paid out of the bishop's pocket, without any consciousness on the part of his lordship. A great part of his furniture he did resolve to sell, having no other means to dispose of it, and the ponies and carriage were transferred by private contract to the use of an old maiden lady in the city. For his present use, Mr Harding took a lodging in Barchester, and thither were conveyed such articles as he wanted for daily use: his music, books, and instruments, his own arm-chair, and Eleanor's pet sofa, her teapoy, and his cellaret, and also the slender but still sufficient contents of his wine cellar. Mrs Grantly had much wished that her sister would reside at Plumstead till her father's house at Crabtree should be ready for her, but Eleanor herself strongly resisted this proposal. It was in vain urged upon her that a lady in lodgings cost more than a gentleman, and that under her father's present circumstances such an expense should be avoided. Eleanor had not pressed her father to give up the hospital in order that she might live at Plumstead Rectory and he alone in his Barchester lodgings, nor did Eleanor think that she would be treating a certain gentleman very fairly if she betook herself to the house which he would be the least desirous of entering of any in the county.
So she got a little bedroom for herself behind the sitting room, and just over the little back parlour of the chemist with whom they were to lodge. There was somewhat of a savour of senna, softened by peppermint, about the place, but on the whole the lodgings were clean and comfortable. The day had been fixed for the migration of the ex-warden, and all Barchester were in a state of excitement on the subject. Opinion was much divided as to the propriety of Mr Harding's conduct. The mercantile part of the community, the mayor and corporation and council, also most of the ladies, were loud in his praise. Nothing could be more noble, nothing more generous, nothing more upright. But the gentry were of a different way of thinking, especially the lawyers and the clergymen. They said such conduct was very weak and undignified, that Mr Harding evinced a lamentable want of esprit de corps as well as courage, and that such an abdication must do much harm, and could do but little good. On the evening before he left, he summoned all the bedesmen into his parlour to wish them good-bye. With Bunce he had been in frequent communication since his return from London, and had been at much pains to explain to the old man the cause of his resignation, without in any way prejudicing the position of his successor. The others also he had seen more or less frequently, and had heard from most of them separately some expression of regret at his departure. But he had postponed his farewell till the last evening. He now bade the maid put wine and glasses on the table, and had the chairs arranged around the room, and sent Bunce to each of the men to request they would come and say farewell to their late warden. Soon the noise of aged scuffling feet was heard upon the gravel and in the little hall, and the 11 men who were enabled to leave their rooms were assembled. "Come in, my friends, come in," said the warden. He was still warden then. "Come in and sit down," and he took the hand of Abel Handy, who was the nearest to him, and led the limping grumbler to a chair. The others followed slowly and bashfully, the infirm, the lame, and the blind. Poor wretches, who had been so happy had they but known it! Now their aged faces were covered with shame, and every kind word from their master was a coal of fire burning on their heads. When first the news had reached them that Mr Harding was going to leave the hospital, it had been received with a kind of triumph. His departure was, as it were, a prelude to success. He had admitted his want of right to the money about which they were disputing, and as it did not belong to him, of course it did to them. The 100 a year to each of them was actually becoming a reality, and Abel Handy was a hero, and Bunce a faint-hearted sycophant, worthy neither honour nor fellowship. But other tidings soon made their way into the old men's rooms. It was first notified to them that the income abandoned by Mr Harding would not come to them, and these accounts were confirmed by Attorney Finney. They were then informed that Mr Harding's place would be at once filled by another. That the new warden could not be a kinder man they all knew; that he would be a less friendly one most suspected; and then came the bitter information that from the moment of Mr Harding's departure the 2d a day, his own peculiar gift, must of necessity be withdrawn. And this was to be the end of all their mighty struggle, of their fight for their rights, of their petition, and their debates, and their hopes. They were to change the best of masters for a possible bad one, and to lose 2d a day each man. No, unfortunate as this was, it was not the worst, or nearly the worst, as will just now be seen.
Sit down, my friends," said the warden. "I want to say a word to you, and to drink your healths before I leave you. Come up here, Moody; here is a chair for you. Come, Jonathan Crumple." And by degrees he got the men to be seated. It was not surprising that they should hang back with faint hearts, having returned so much kindness with such deep ingratitude. Last of all of them came Bunce, and with sorrowful mien and slow step got into his accustomed seat near the fireplace. When they were all in their places, Mr Harding rose to address them, and then, finding himself not quite at home on his legs, he sat down again. "My dear old friends," said he, "you all know that I am going to leave you." There was a sort of murmur ran round the room, intended perhaps to express regret at his departure, but it was but a murmur, and might have meant that or anything else. "There has been lately some misunderstanding between us. You have thought, I believe, that you did not get all that you were entitled to, and that the funds of the hospital have not been properly disposed of. As for me, I cannot say what should be the disposition of these moneys, or how they should be managed, and I have therefore thought it best to go."
"We never wanted to drive your reverence out of it,"
said Handy.
"No, indeed, your reverence,"
said Skulpit.
"We never thought it would come to this. When I signed the petition, that is, I didn't sign it because—"
"Let his reverence speak, can't you?"
said Moody. "No," continued Mr Harding, "I am sure you did not wish to turn me out, but I thought it best to leave you. I am not a very good hand at a lawsuit, as you may all guess, and when it seemed necessary that our ordinary quiet mode of living should be disturbed, I thought it better to go. I am neither angry nor offended with any man in the hospital." Here Bunce uttered a kind of groan, very clearly expressive of disagreement. "I am neither angry nor displeased with any man in the hospital," repeated Mr Harding emphatically. "If any man has been wrong, and I don't say any man has, he has erred through wrong advice. In this country all are entitled to look for their own rights, and you have done no more. As long as your interests and my interests were at variance, I could give you no counsel on this subject, but this connection between us has ceased. My income can no longer depend on your doings, and therefore, as I leave you, I venture to offer to you my advice." The men all declared that they would from henceforth be entirely guided by Mr Harding's opinion in their affairs. "Some gentleman will probably take my place here very soon, and I strongly advise you to be prepared to receive him in a kindly spirit, and to raise no further question among yourselves as to the amount of his income. Were you to succeed in lessening what he has to receive, you would not increase your own allowance. The surplus would not go to you. Your wants are adequately provided for, and your position could hardly be improved."
"God bless your reverence, we knows it,"
said Spriggs.
"It's all true, your reverence," said Skulpit.
"We sees it all now."
"Yes, Mr Harding,"
said Bunce, opening his mouth for the first time.
"I believe they do understand it now that they've driven from under the same roof with them such a master as not one of them will ever know again, now that they're like to be in sore want of a friend.
"Come, come, Bunce," said Mr Harding, blowing his nose and manoeuvring to wipe his eyes at the same time. "Oh, as to that," said Handy, "we none of us never wanted to do Mr Harding no harm. If he's going now, it's not along of us, and I don't see for what Mr Bunce speaks up again us that way."
"You've ruined yourselves, and you've ruined me too, and that's why," said Bunce.
"Nonsense, Bunce," said Mr Harding. "There's nobody ruined at all. I hope you'll let me leave you all friends. I hope you'll all drink a glass of wine in friendly feeling with me and with one another. You'll have a good friend, I don't doubt, in your new warden, and if ever you want any other, why, after all, I'm not going so far off but that I shall sometimes see you." And then, having finished his speech, Mr Harding filled all the glasses, and himself handed each a glass to the men round him, and raising his own, said, "God bless you all. You have my heartfelt wishes for your welfare. I hope you may live contented, and die trusting in the Lord Jesus Christ, and thankful to Almighty God for the good things he has given you. God bless you, my friends." And Mr Harding drank his wine. Another murmur, somewhat more articulate than the first, passed round the circle, and this time it was intended to imply a blessing on Mr Harding. It had, however, but little cordiality in it. Poor old men! How could they be cordial with their sore consciences and shamed faces? How could they bid God bless him with hearty voices and a true benison, knowing as they did that their vile cabal had driven him from his happy home, and sent him in his old age to seek shelter under a strange roof tree? They did their best, however. They drank their wine and withdrew. As they left the hall door, Mr Harding shook hands with each of the men, and spoke a kind word to them about their individual cases and ailments, and so they departed, answering his questions in the fewest words, and retreated to their dens, a sorrowful, repentant crew, all but Bunce, who still remained to make his own farewell. "There's poor old Bell," said Mr Harding. "I mustn't go without saying a word to him. Come through with me, Bunce, and bring the wine with you." And so they went through to the men's cottages, and found the old man propped up as usual in his bed. "I've come to say good bye to you, Bell," said Mr Harding, speaking loud, for the old man was deaf. "And are you going away then, really?" asked Bell. "Indeed I am, and I've brought you a glass of wine, so that we may part friends, as we lived, you know." The old man took the proffered glass in his shaking hands, and drank it eagerly. "God bless you, Bell," said Mr Harding. "Good bye, my old friend." "And so you're really going?" the man again asked. "Indeed I am, Bell." The poor old bedridden creature still kept Mr Harding's hand in his own, and the warden thought that he had met with something like warmth of feeling in the one of all his subjects from whom it was the least likely to be expected, for poor old Bell had nearly outlived all human feelings. "And your reverence?" said he, and then he paused, while his old palsied head shook horribly, and his shrivelled cheeks sank lower within his jaws, and his glazy eye gleamed with a momentary light. "And your reverence, shall we get the 100 a year then?" How gently did Mr Harding try to extinguish the false hope of money which had been so wretchedly raised to disturb the quiet of the dying man. One other week, and his mortal coil would be shuffled off.
In one short week would God resume his soul, and set it apart for its irrevocable doom. 7 more tedious days and nights of senseless inactivity, and all would be over for poor Bell in this world. And yet, with his last audible words, he was demanding his moneyed rights, and asserting himself to be the proper heir of John Hiram's bounty. Not on him, poor sinner as he was, be the load of such sin. Mr Harding returned to his parlour, meditating with a sick heart on what he had seen, and Bunce with him. We will not describe the parting of these 2 good men, for good men they were. It was in vain that the late warden endeavoured to comfort the heart of the old bedesman. Poor old Bunce felt that his days of comfort were gone. The hospital had to him been a happy home, but it could be so no longer. He had had honour there, and friendship. He had recognised his master and been recognised. All his wants, both of soul and body, had been supplied, and he had been a happy man. He wept grievously as he parted from his friend, and the tears of an old man are bitter. "It is all over for me in this world," said he, as he gave the last squeeze to Mr Harding's hand. "I have now to forgive those who have injured me, and to die." And so the old man went out, and then Mr Harding gave way to his grief, and he too wept aloud. End of chapter 20. Recording by Nick Whitley, Purley, United Kingdom. Chapter 21 of The Warden, by Anthony Trollope. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Nick Whitley, Purley, United Kingdom. Chapter 21. Conclusion. Our tale is now done, and it only remains to us to collect the scattered threads of our little story, and to tie them into a seemly knot. This will not be a work of labour, either to the author or to his readers. We have not to deal with many personages, or with stirring events, and were it not for the custom of the thing, we might leave it to the imagination of all concerned to conceive how affairs at Barchester arranged themselves. On the morning after the day last alluded to, Mr Harding, at an early hour, walked out of the hospital with his daughter under his arm, and sat down quietly to breakfast at his lodgings over the chemist's shop. There was no parade about his departure. No one, not even Bunce, was there to witness it. Had he walked to the apothecary's thus early to get a piece of court plaster or a box of lozenges, he could not have done it with less appearance of an important movement. There was a tear in Eleanor's eye as she passed through the big gateway and over the bridge, but Mr Harding walked with an elastic step, and entered his new abode with a pleasant face. "Now, my dear," said he, "you have everything ready, and you can make tea here just as nicely as in the parlour at the hospital." So Eleanor took off her bonnet and made the tea. After this manner did the late warden of Barchester Hospital accomplish his flitting, and change his residence. It was not long before the archdeacon brought his father to discuss the subject of a new warden. Of course he looked upon the nomination as his own, and he had in his eye 3 or 4 fitting candidates. Seeing that Mr Cummins's plan as to the living of Puddingdale could not be brought to bear, how can I describe the astonishment which confounded him when his father declared that he would appoint no successor to Mr Harding. "If we can get the matter set to rights, Mr Harding will return," said the bishop.
and if we cannot, it will be wrong to put any other gentleman into so cruel a position. It was in vain that the archdeacon argued and lectured, and even threatened. In vain he my lorded his poor father in his sternest manner. In vain his "Good heavens!" were ejaculated in a tone that might have moved a whole synod, let alone one weak and aged bishop. Nothing could induce his father to fill up the vacancy caused by Mr Harding's retirement. Even John Bold would have pitied the feelings with which the archdeacon returned to Plumstead. The church was falling, nay, already in ruins. Its dignitaries were yielding without a struggle before the blows of its antagonists, and one of its most respected bishops, his own father, the man considered by all the world as being in such matters under his, Dr Grantly's, control, had positively resolved to capitulate and own himself vanquished. And how fared the hospital under this resolve of its visitor? Badly indeed. It is now some years since Mr Harding left it, and the warden's house is still tenantless. Old Bell has died, and Billy Gazy. The one-eyed Spriggs has drunk himself to death, and 3 others of the 12 have been gathered into the churchyard mould. 6 have gone, and the 6 vacancies remain unfilled. Yes, 6 have died with no kind friend to solace their last moments, with no wealthy neighbour to administer comforts and ease the stings of death. Mr Harding indeed did not desert them. From him they had such consolation as a dying man may receive from his Christian pastor, but it was the occasional kindness of a stranger which ministered to them, and not the constant presence of a master, a neighbour, and a friend. Nor were those who remained better off than those who died. Dissensions rose among them, and contests for pre-eminence, and then they began to understand that soon one among them would be the last. Some one wretched being would be alone there in that now comfortless hospital, the miserable relic of what had once been so good and so comfortable. The building of the hospital itself has not been allowed to go to ruins. Mr Chadwick, who still holds his stewardship and pays the accruing rents into an account opened at a bank for the purpose, sees to that. But the whole place has become disordered and ugly. The warden's garden is a wretched wilderness. The drive and paths are covered with weeds. The flower beds are bare, and the unshorn lawn is now a mass of long damp grass and unwholesome moss. The beauty of the place is gone. Its attractions have withered. Alas, a very few years since it was the prettiest spot in Barchester, and now it is a disgrace to the city. Mr Harding did not go out to Crabtree Parva. An arrangement was made which respected the homestead of Mr Smith and his happy family, and put Mr Harding into possession of a small living within the walls of the city. It is the smallest possible parish, containing a part of the cathedral close and a few old houses adjoining. The church is a singular little Gothic building, perched over a gateway through which the close is entered, and is approached by a flight of stone steps which leads down under the archway of the gate. It is no bigger than an ordinary room, perhaps 27 feet long by 18 wide, but still it is a perfect church. It contains an old carved pulpit and reading desk,
a tiny altar under a window filled with dark, old coloured glass, a font, some half dozen pews, and perhaps a dozen seats for the poor, and also a vestry. The roof is high pitched and of black old oak, and the 3 large beams which support it run down to the side walls, and terminate in grotesquely carved faces, 2 devils and an angel on one side, 2 angels and a devil on the other. Such is the church of St Cuthbert at Barchester, of which Mr Harding became rector, with a clear income of £75 a year. Here he performs afternoon service every Sunday, and administers the sacrament once in every 3 months. His audience is not large, and had they been so he could not have accommodated them, but enough come to fill his 6 pews, and on the front seat of those devoted to the poor is always to be seen our old friend Mr Bunce, decently arrayed in his bedesman's gown. Mr Harding is still precentor of Barchester, and it is very rarely the case that those who attend the Sunday morning service miss the gratification of hearing him chant the litany as no other man in England can do it. He is neither a discontented nor an unhappy man. He still inhabits the lodgings to which he went on leaving the hospital, but he now has them to himself. 3 months after that time Eleanor became Mrs Bold, and of course removed to her husband's house. There were some difficulties to be got over on the occasion of the marriage. The archdeacon, who could not so soon overcome his grief, would not be persuaded to grace the ceremony with his presence, but he allowed his wife and children to be there. The marriage took place in the cathedral, and the bishop himself officiated. It was the last occasion on which he ever did so, and though he still lives, it is not probable that he will ever do so again. Not long after the marriage, perhaps 6 months, when Eleanor's bridal honours were fading, and persons were beginning to call her Mrs Bold without twittering, the archdeacon consented to meet John Bold at a dinner party, and since that time they have become almost friends. The archdeacon firmly believes that his brother-in-law was, as a bachelor, an infidel, an unbeliever in the great truths of our religion, but that matrimony has opened his eyes, as it has those of others.
And Bold is equally inclined to think that time has softened the asperities of the archdeacon's character.
Friends though they are, they do not often revert to the feud of the hospital. Mr Harding, we say, is not an unhappy man. He keeps his lodgings, but they are of little use to him, except as being the one spot on earth which he calls his own. His time is spent chiefly at his daughter's or at the palace. He is never left alone, even should he wish to be so, and within a 12-month of Eleanor's marriage his determination to live at his own lodging had been so far broken through and abandoned that he consented to have his violoncello permanently removed to his daughter's house. Every other day a message is brought to him from the bishop. The bishop's compliments, and his lordship is not very well today, and he hopes Mr Harding will dine with him. This bulletin as to the old man's health is a myth, for though he is over 80, he is never ill, and will probably die some day, as a spark goes out, gradually and without a struggle. Mr Harding does dine with him very often, which means going to the palace at 3 and remaining till 10, and whenever he does not, the bishop whines and says that the port wine is corked, and complains that nobody attends to him, and frets himself off to bed an hour before his time. It was long before the people of Barchester forgot to call Mr Harding by his long, well-known name of Warden. It had become so customary to say Mr. Warden that it was not easily dropped. "No, no," he always says when so addressed, "not warden now, only precentor." Chapter 21. Recording by Nick Whitley, Purley, United Kingdom. End of The Warden, by Anthony Trollope.